The overhead surgical lights hum with a steady fluorescent intensity, casting everything in the operating room into sharp relief. Dr. Roger Leir stands at the sterile table, gloved hands poised above his patient's trembling left hand. The patient, a middle-aged construction worker named Tim, has requested only local anesthesia. He wants to see it come out. He needs to see it. His eyes are wide, pupils dilated not from medication but from something closer to dread. The scalpel makes its first careful incision along the fleshy part of Tim's palm, just below his thumb. No blood wells up immediately. The cut is precise, methodical. Dr. Leir has performed this procedure 16 times before, and each time carries the same peculiar tension. The same question hanging in the air, like static electricity. As the incision deepens, the dermal layers peel back to reveal something that shouldn't be there. A dark metallic fragment, roughly the size of a sunflower seed, sits embedded in the subcutaneous tissue. Under the surgical lights, it seems to drink in the illumination before reflecting it back with an odd oily sheen. Tim inhales sharply. The object is real. Undeniably, physically real. This is not a splinter. This is not shrapnel from an accident Tim can remember. There is no scar tissue surrounding the object, no inflammatory response, no entry wound anywhere on the hand's surface. The skin above it had been completely intact, unblemished, as though the object had simply materialized inside his flesh. Dr. Leir uses surgical forceps to grip the fragment, applying gentle traction. It resists at first, then slides free with a sensation Tim will later describe as deeply, fundamentally wrong. Not painful, but profoundly disturbing, like something being removed from a place it had chemically bonded to. The metallic object sits in the surgical tray now, inert but somehow commanding attention. Every person in that operating room feels it. The nurses, the surgical assistant, Dr. Leir himself, they are looking at evidence of something that defies comfortable explanation. This is not folklore. This is not a campfire story embellished over decades. This is a physical object that will be photographed, measured, subjected to spectrographic analysis, and stored in a laboratory where it sits even now, years later, waiting to surrender its secret. So we must ask the question that refuses to be dismissed. What happens when objects with no entry wounds are found embedded in human tissue? What do we do with evidence that contradicts everything we understand about how foreign objects enter the body? We want simple answers. We want rational explanations. We want Tim to remember an accident, a moment of impact, a logical chain of cause and effect. But Tim remembers nothing. No injury, no penetration, just the growing awareness, over weeks and months, that something was inside him that didn't belong. Tim is not alone. There are 6 cases we will examine together, 6 ordinary people living unremarkable lives until they became unwilling carriers of something inexplicable. A police officer in California, a housewife in Texas, a teenager in Florida, Each discovered objects beneath their skin. Each underwent surgical removal. Each object now resides in storage, cataloged and analyzed, presenting data that raises more questions than it answers. These are not abstract mysteries. These are not theoretical puzzles debated in academic journals. These are fragments of metal and unusual composite materials extracted from human beings that possess properties that should not exist. Some of these objects emit faint electromagnetic frequencies. Some are encased in biological membranes the human body does not naturally produce. Some contain isotopic ratios that don't match any known terrestrial source. The evidence is physical. The implications are staggering. And the question remains unanswered, hanging over every examination table. Every laboratory analysis, every sleepless night experienced by those who carried these objects inside themselves. Where did they come from? How did they get there? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what were they doing inside human tissue? The highway stretched empty under the pale glow of a quarter moon, its asphalt ribbon cutting through the scrubland of rural California. It was August of 1995, and the man behind the wheel, a businessman in his early 40s, we will call Thomas, had made this drive dozens of times before. The route between his home in the valley and the client meeting in the next county was familiar enough that his mind could wander, letting muscle memory guide the car through the gentle curves and long straightaways. But on this particular night, something would happen that would transform Thomas from a skeptic who rolled his eyes at tabloid headlines into a man who would voluntarily undergo surgery to remove something that modern science insisted should not exist. He remembered leaving the meeting just after 7 in the evening. He remembered the sun setting in his rearview mirror, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. He remembered turning on the radio and finding a station playing classic rock, the familiar guitar riffs of songs from his youth, filling the car's interior. And then, nothing. The next thing Thomas knew with any certainty, he was pulling into his driveway at what his dashboard clock insisted was 11:47 at night. 4 hours had passed. The drive should have taken 90 minutes at most. In the days that followed, Thomas tried to rationalize the missing time. Perhaps he had been more exhausted than he realized and pulled over to sleep. Maybe he had stopped for dinner and simply forgotten in a moment of distraction. But there was no memory of pulling over. No receipt for food. No logical explanation for where those 2.5 unaccounted hours had gone. And there was something else, something that began as a minor irritation, but would grow into undeniable physical evidence. His left foot hurt. At first, it was just a dull ache in his big toe, the kind of thing easily dismissed as a minor injury forgotten in the course of a busy day. But the pain persisted, then intensified. Within a week, Thomas noticed a small raised area on the top of his toe, a bump beneath the skin that was tender to the touch. He tried to remember stubbing it, stepping on something sharp, any mundane explanation. Nothing came to mind. The pain grew worse at night, a throbbing sensation that kept him awake. And with the sleeplessness came something unexpected, something that frightened him more than the physical discomfort. Fragments of memory began to surface, or perhaps they were dreams. He could no longer tell the difference. In these fragmentary recollections, Thomas found himself in a white room. Not the off-white of a normal wall, but a luminous, almost glowing white that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room had no visible corners, no clear sense of where walls met ceiling or floor. It was disorienting, like being suspended in a space without reference points. And there were figures. They remained at the edges of his vision, never quite coming into focus, no matter how hard he tried to turn his head to look at them directly. What he could see were hands, if they could be called that. Fingers that were too long, too thin, moving with an unsettling precision as they reached toward him. He remembered pressure on his foot, a sensation like cold metal against his skin. And then the memory would fragment again, dissolving like smoke. Thomas tried to push these images aside, telling himself they were just stress-induced nightmares, but the pain in his toe became impossible to ignore. 2 months after that missing night on the highway, he finally visited a doctor. The physician examined the toe, noted the raised area, and ordered an X-ray to rule out a bone spur or some other common explanation. When the X-ray came back, the doctor's expression shifted from routine professional concern to genuine puzzlement. There, clearly visible in the image, was a foreign object embedded in the soft tissue of Thomas's toe. But it was not a piece of glass from a forgotten injury or a splinter of wood. It was geometric, perfectly triangular, and it appeared to be metallic. The doctor referred Thomas to a specialist, and through a series of connections and conversations, Thomas eventually found himself in the office of Dr. Roger Leir, a podiatric surgeon who had begun to take an interest in cases that existed at the strange intersection of medicine and the unexplained. Dr. Leir had heard stories before, whispered accounts of people claiming to have objects inside their bodies that they could not explain. Most turned out to be nothing more than mundane foreign bodies with dramatic backstories. But when he looked at Thomas's X-ray, he felt a prickle of genuine scientific curiosity. The object was too perfectly formed, too symmetrically triangular to be a random piece of debris. Dr. Leir agreed to perform the extraction in January of 1996, just a few months after Thomas's missing time experience. The procedure was scheduled as a relatively simple outpatient surgery. Dr. Leir would make a small incision, locate the foreign object, and remove it. Standard practice dictated that any foreign body and tissue for months would be surrounded by inflammation, scar tissue, the body's natural response to an intruder. But when Dr. Leir made his incision and carefully separated the tissue layers, What he found defied his decades of medical experience. The triangular object was there, exactly where the X-ray had shown it would be. But surrounding it was a dark, oily-looking membrane, a biological coating that appeared to have formed around the metal. This, in itself, was unusual, but not unprecedented. What shocked Dr. Leir was the complete absence of inflammation. No redness. No signs of infection. No buildup of scar tissue trying to wall off the foreign material. The surrounding tissue looked healthy, undisturbed, as if the object had always been there, and the body had simply accepted its presence without question. In all his years of practice, Dr. Leir had never seen the human immune system respond, or rather, not respond, in such a way. It was as if something had told the body that this object belonged, that it should not be rejected or attacked. Using surgical instruments, Dr. Leir carefully extracted the object and its surrounding membrane. The triangular piece of metal was small, measuring only a few millimeters on each side, but it was dense and precisely formed. Under magnification, its edges showed no signs of the rough irregularity you would expect from a piece of industrial debris or a fragment of broken machinery. It looked manufactured, deliberately shaped. The dark membrane that encased it was even stranger. Later analysis would reveal it to be a biological matrix containing elements that appeared to be a combination of Thomas's own proteins and something else, something that did not match any known biological mark. But the truly extraordinary findings came weeks later, when Dr. Leir sent the object to a laboratory for metallurgical analysis. The lab examined the isotopic composition of the metal, measuring the ratios of different isotopes present in the sample. Every element on Earth has a characteristic isotopic signature, a specific ratio of different isotope variants that forms through natural processes in our planet's geology. These ratios are like fingerprints, identifying where and how elements were formed. The metals from Thomas's toe showed isotopic ratios that did not match terrestrial norms. The proportions were wrong, skewed in ways that suggested the material had not originated from Earth's natural processes. The laboratory ran the tests multiple times, checking for contamination or equipment error. The results remained consistent. The metal contained elements found on Earth, nickel and iron primarily, but in isotopic combinations that existed outside the expected terrestrial range. Some scientists who later reviewed the data suggested the ratios could indicate the material had been subjected to extreme conditions not found naturally on our planet, perhaps the interior of a nuclear reactor or some other high-energy environment. But Thomas had no exposure to such facilities. He was a businessman who sold office supplies. The most exotic technology he regularly encountered was a fax machine. Dr. Leir documented everything meticulously. He photographed the extraction procedure, preserved the object and its membrane, kept detailed notes on the absence of inflammation, and retained all the laboratory reports. He knew that such claims would be met with skepticism, that the scientific community would demand extraordinary evidence for what seemed to be an extraordinary conclusion. And he knew that even with all this documentation, there would be those who would find conventional explanations, however unlikely. Perhaps the object had been embedded years earlier in a forgotten accident, and Thomas's memory of that event had simply faded. Perhaps the isotopic ratios were the result of industrial processing that created unusual elemental signatures. Perhaps the biological membrane was simply a rare but natural response that medical science had not yet fully categorized. But Thomas knew what he experienced. The missing time was real. The fragmentary memories of the white room and the elongated fingers were real, or at least they felt real with an intensity that no ordinary dream possessed. And the object that had been removed from his body was undeniably real, sitting in a laboratory vial with its inexplicable isotopic signature. In the months after the surgery, Thomas tried to resume his normal life. The pain in his toe was gone. The physical evidence had been removed. But he found himself driving that same stretch of highway with a new wariness, his eyes scanning the night sky, wondering if he would experience another episode of missing time, if he would wake up in his driveway hours later with another unexplained mass growing beneath his skin. Dr. Leir's findings were presented at conferences and published in specialized journals that existed at the fringes of mainstream science. Believers saw the case as definitive proof of alien visitation and the reality of abduction phenomena. Skeptics pointed to the lack of absolute proof, the possibility of contamination in the laboratory analysis, the unreliability of memory, especially when that memory is of traumatic or extraordinary events. The debate continues to this day, with Thomas's case remaining one of the most well-documented instances of a claimed alien implant ever recorded. What makes this case particularly compelling is not just the physical evidence, though that certainly sets it apart from the vast majority of abduction claims. It is the totality of the experience, the missing time, the fragmented memories, the physical object that appeared where no object should be, and most mysteriously, the biological acceptance, the way Thomas's body integrated the foreign material without the expected immune response, as if it had received instructions to accommodate rather than reject. This detail alone raises unsettling question. If the object was placed there deliberately, what was its purpose? Was it a tracking device, a means of monitoring or locating Thomas? Was it something more complex, perhaps a device designed to interact with his biology in ways we cannot yet measure or understand? Or was it, as some researchers have theorized, a kind of tag, a mark indicating that this individual had been selected for study? The case of Thomas and his triangular implant opened the door for Dr. Leir to examine other individuals who claim to have foreign objects in their bodies following experiences of missing time or suspected abduction. In the years that followed, he would perform additional surgeries, removing more objects that shared similar characteristics: precise geometric shapes, the strange dark membrane, the absence of inflammation, and in several cases, isotopic ratios that fell outside terrestrial norms. Each case added to a growing body of physical evidence that something unexplained was occurring, something that left tangible traces in human tissue. For those who experience missing time, the psychological impact can be as profound as any physical evidence. Time is the framework through which we understand our existence. We trust that our memories, however imperfect, provide a continuous narrative of our lives. When hours simply vanish, when we find ourselves in a place with no recollection of the journey, it fractures that trust. It suggests that our consciousness, our sense of self, is more fragile than we want to believe. And when that missing time is followed by physical evidence of something done to our bodies without our knowledge or consent, it violates us in a deeply fundamental way. Thomas's story resonates because it speaks to these primal fears: the fear of losing control, the fear that we are not alone, and perhaps most disturbing, the fear that we might be powerless subjects in experiments we cannot comprehend, conducted by entities whose motivations remain entirely opaque. Sarah Mitchell had been hearing the sound for as long as she could remember. It started in childhood, a high-pitched frequency that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep inside her skull, just behind her right ear. She described it as the whine of old electronics, that distinctive tone that hovers just at the edge of human perception. For decades, she assumed everyone heard such things, that it was simply the background noise of living in modern California, surrounded by power lines and cell towers and the endless hum of civilization. But when she mentioned it casually to her husband one evening in their Bakersfield home, he looked at her with genuine concern. He heard nothing. Neither did their teenage daughter. Neither did anyone else, she asked. Sarah was 42 years old when she finally decided to see a doctor about it. By then, the sound had become more than an annoyance. It was affecting her sleep, her concentration, her sense of reality itself. The frequency would spike at certain times, particularly at night when she lay in the darkness of her bedroom. Those nights triggered something else, something she had spent most of her adult life trying to forget. Memories that felt less like memories, and more like fragments of dreams, though they carried the weight of actual experience. She remembered being 7 years old and waking to find her bedroom filled with an odd bluish light. She remembered small figures standing at the foot of her bed, their silhouettes somehow wrong in proportions she could never quite articulate when trying to describe them later. Most of all, she remembered paralysis, the absolute inability to move or scream, her body frozen while her mind raced with terror. For years, Sarah had dismissed these recollections as nightmares, the overactive imagination of a child who had watched too many science fiction movies. But there was one image that refused to be categorized as mere dream. It was the table. Cold, hard, impossibly bright lights overhead. The sensation of being observed, examined, as if she were a specimen rather than a person. She could feel the coldness of the metal against her bare skin, could remember the smell of something sterile and foreign, could recall the presence of those figures hovering at the periphery of her vision. And always, there was that sound. The same high-pitched frequency that followed her into waking life. The first doctor she consulted was dismissive. Tinnitus, he said, a common condition. Perhaps stress-induced. He recommended white noise machines and cognitive behavioral therapy. But Sarah insisted on imaging. Something felt wrong, she told him. Not just psychologically, but physically. There was a sensation of pressure behind her right ear, a spot that sometimes grew tender to the touch. Reluctantly, he ordered an MRI. The technician who reviewed the initial scans called the doctor back into the room twice. There was something there, a small anomaly in the soft tissue behind Sarah's ear, nestled close to the mastoid process. It appeared dense on the imaging, metallic perhaps, and it was roughly T-shaped. Sarah's general practitioner referred her to a specialist, Dr. Raymond Chen, an ear, nose, and throat surgeon at a private practice in Sacramento. Dr. Chen had seen foreign objects before, shrapnel from accidents, beads lodged by curious children, even a small battery once. But when he examined Sarah's scans, he found himself puzzled. The object appeared to be integrated into the surrounding tissue in a way that suggested long-term presence, potentially decades. More unusual was its position, nestled against a cluster of nerve endings that connected to the inner ear and parts of the temporal lobe. During the examination, Dr. Chen used a handheld electromagnetic field detector, a device typically employed to locate metallic fragments before surgery. The readings were immediately abnormal. The object was emitting a weak but detectable electromagnetic field, pulsing at regular intervals. The frequency matched almost exactly the pitch of the sound Sarah had been hearing her entire life. Dr. Chen brought in a colleague, Dr. Lisa Yamamoto, a neurologist with experience in unusual neurological cases. Together, they documented the readings, taking multiple measurements over the course of an hour. The field strength was weak, barely registering on their equipment, but it was undeniably present. More remarkably, the pulses seemed to correspond with Sarah's reports of when the sound intensified. When she reported hearing the frequency grow louder, the electromagnetic readings spiked correspondingly. Sarah's reaction to this discovery was complex. Part of her felt vindicated. She was not imagining things. The sound was real, measurably real, generated by something physical inside her body. But another part of her, a deeper part she had kept locked away for 35 years, felt a rising tide of existential dread. If the sound was real, what else might be real? Those childhood visitations, that cold table, those figures in the darkness? She found herself trembling during the consultation, not from fear of the upcoming surgery, but from the weight of implications she was not ready to confront. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In that interval, Sarah's nights became increasingly difficult. The childhood memories grew more vivid, more insistent. She would wake at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, convinced she could see shadows moving in the corners of her bedroom. Her husband grew worried, suggesting perhaps they should wait, seek more opinions, consider the psychological toll this was taking. But Sarah refused. She needed to know. She needed to see whatever had been placed inside her body, needed to hold it in her hands and confirm its existence outside her own skull. The extraction procedure took place on a Tuesday morning in late September. Dr. Chen and Dr. Yamamoto were joined by Dr. Marcus Webb, a surgeon with experience in removing embedded objects from neural tissue. The challenge was the integration. The object had been in place so long that nerve tissue had grown around it, incorporating it into the body's own structure. This was not simply a foreign object that could be pulled free. It would require delicate dissection, separating nerve from metal without causing permanent damage to Sarah's hearing or balance. The surgical team worked under local anesthesia. Sarah had requested to remain conscious, wanting to be aware when the object was removed. She lay on her side, her head secured, while the surgeons made a small incision behind her right ear. Dr. Webb later described the moment they first visualized the object directly. It was indeed T-shaped, approximately 8 millimeters long, constructed from an alloy they could not immediately identify. The surface appeared smooth, almost polished, with no visible seams or attachment points. Most striking was how intimately it had merged with the surrounding tissue. Small nerve fibers had wrapped around the shaft of the T, integrating so completely that Dr. Webb initially had difficulty determining where metal ended and biology began. As they began the careful process of separation, Dr. Yamamoto monitored the electromagnetic readings. The field remained steady, pulsing with the same regular rhythm it had shown before surgery. Sarah, conscious throughout, reported that she could still hear the frequency, though it seemed to be growing louder, more insistent, as if responding to the disturbance. Then, at the moment Dr. Webb successfully detached the last nerve connection and lifted the object free from Sarah's tissue, something unexpected occurred. The electromagnetic field vanished. Completely. Instantly. Dr. Yamamoto checked her equipment, thinking perhaps a connection had failed, but the device was functioning normally. The object, now separated from Sarah's body, had simply gone silent. Sarah felt the absence immediately. The frequency that had accompanied her for 42 years, that had been the soundtrack to her existence, disappeared. The silence was profound, almost overwhelming. She began to cry, though she could not explain whether the tears were from relief or from a loss she had not anticipated. The object that had been part of her, that had perhaps been placed inside her during that half-remembered night, when she was 7 years old, was now just an inert piece of metal on a surgical tray. The surgical team preserved the object for analysis. Dr. Chen sent it to a materials laboratory affiliated with the University of California, requesting a full compositional breakdown. The results raised more questions than they answered. The alloy was unusual, composed primarily of elements common enough on Earth, titanium and silicon among them. But arranged in a crystalline structure, the lab technicians had difficulty categorizing. The density was abnormal, heavier than it should be for its size. Most puzzling was the complete absence of any power source. There were no batteries, no capacitors, no obvious mechanism that could have generated the electromagnetic field the doctors had measured before extraction. Yet, they had documentation, multiple readings taken over weeks, proving that the object had been actively emitting a signal while inside Sarah's body. Dr. Webb, in his post-surgical report, noted that the nerve integration suggested the object had been in place for at least 20 to 30 years, possibly longer. The way the tissue had grown around it indicated a slow, organic process of incorporation, as if Sarah's body had gradually accepted the foreign object as part of itself. He also observed something he found difficult to explain in clinical terms. The nerve fibers that had wrapped around the object showed patterns of growth that seemed almost purposeful, as if they had been guided or encouraged to connect in specific ways. He stopped short of speculation in his official report, but in private conversation with Dr. Chen, he admitted that the configuration looked less like random biological response and more like deliberate interface design. Sarah's psychological state in the weeks following surgery was fragile. The relief of silence, of finally being free from the constant frequency, was profound. She slept better than she had in decades, but the confirmation that the object was real, that it had been inside her body for most of her life, forced her to confront questions she had spent years avoiding. If someone or something had placed that device inside her when she was a child, then her memories of visitation were not nightmares. The cold table was real. The figures were real. The paralysis, the examination, the violation of her body, and her sense of safety, all of it was real. She began seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, though she found it difficult to discuss the specifics. How do you process the reality of childhood abduction when the abductors remain unidentified and the purpose remains unknown? The object itself remained in storage, a small T-shaped mystery that had gone silent the moment it was separated from human tissue. Sarah requested to see it one final time before deciding what to do with it. Dr. Chen brought it to her in a small sealed container. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight, running her finger along its smooth surface. It was warm from her hand, but otherwise unremarkable. Just a piece of worked metal that could have been anything from anywhere. She thought about the 7-year-old girl she had been, terrified and alone in a room filled with blue light. She thought about the decades of sound, the constant reminder of something she could not explain. And she thought about the silence she now lived in, a silence that felt like absence, like a part of her had been removed along with the device. She asked Dr. Chen to keep it, to continue studying it, to perhaps one day understand what it was and why it had been placed inside a child. Then she went home to her family, to her ordinary life in California, carrying the extraordinary knowledge that she had been marked, chosen, altered in ways she might never fully comprehend. The high plains of Montana stretch endlessly in every direction, a landscape so vast and empty that a man can go days without seeing another soul. It is a place where ranchers measure their spreads in sections, not acres, where the wind carries no sound of human voices, only the whisper of grass and the distant call of cattle. In the spring of 1997, Tom Hendricks worked his family's ranch just as his father had done, and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Hendricks had pulled their living from this stubborn earth, had learned to read weather in the bellies of clouds, had accepted that isolation was simply the price of this particular freedom. Tom was 43 years old that year, a quiet man whose hands bore the scars of barbed wire and honest work. He rose before dawn, as ranchers do, and on the morning of March 22nd, he drove his pickup out to check the north pasture where he'd left 24 head of cattle grazing. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when he found them. 3 heifers down, arranged in a pattern that made no sense to any rancher who'd spent his life understanding how cattle died. The animals lay roughly equidistant from each other, forming what Tom would later describe as a triangle. But it was the condition of the bodies that stopped him cold. Each heifer had been opened with surgical precision, the udders removed entirely, excised along lines so clean they might have been made with a scalpel. The left eye of each animal was gone, the socket emptied without any tearing of the surrounding tissue. Most disturbing were the circular cuts around the jaw, where tongues had been extracted deep into the throat, far deeper than seemed possible, without simply butchering the entire head. Tom had found dead cattle before. He'd seen what coyotes did, what mountain lions left behind. He knew the messy reality of predation, the scattered gore and drag marks, the torn flesh and broken bones where scavengers fought over remained. This was something else entirely. The edges of the wounds showed no bleeding, no inflammation. The grass beneath the bodies was undisturbed, showing no sign of struggle. When he circled wider, looking for tracks, he found his own boot prints in the soft earth, but nothing else. Not the paw prints of predators. Not tire tracks from rustlers. Nothing at all to explain how 3 animals had been mutilated and arranged in his pasture without leaving a single trace. He reported it to the county sheriff, a man named Dawson, who'd held the position for 16 years and had seen his share of strange things. Dawson drove out with a deputy, photographed the scene, and sent samples to the state veterinary laboratory in Bozeman, Unexplained. The official report came back 2 weeks later. Cause of death undetermined, wounds inconsistent with known predators, no evidence of disease. The language was carefully neutral, offering no theories, no explanations. Just clinical observations that raised more questions than they answered. The local newspaper ran a brief story. Some neighbors called to offer awkward condolences. A few mentioned other incidents, cattle found mutilated on ranches across Montana and Wyoming and Colorado, cases stretching back decades. Stories that ranchers told in low voices, never quite knowing whether they believed what they were saying. Tom listened and said little. He buried the heifers in a ravine on the western edge of his property and tried to return to the familiar rhythms of ranch work. But 6 weeks after finding the cattle, Tom discovered the lump. It was in his left calf, deep in the muscle, roughly the size of a large pea. He found it while sitting on the edge of his bed, pulling off his boots after a long day riding fence lines. His hand brushed against his leg and felt something that shouldn't be there. A hardness beneath the skin that sent a jolt of recognition through him. He couldn't quite explain. He pressed on it, felt it move slightly under pressure, solid and foreign. Tom didn't go to a doctor. Not right away. He told himself it was probably nothing, maybe a cyst or a calcium deposit. But in the quiet hours before sleep, his mind returned again and again to those 3 heifers. He remembered something he'd noticed, but hadn't mentioned in his statement to the sheriff. On one of the animals, on the rear left leg, he'd found a small puncture mark, perfectly round, no larger than the tip of a ballpoint pen, but deep enough that he'd noticed it while examining the body. He'd thought little of it at the time, overwhelmed by the larger mutilations. Now he couldn't stop thinking about it. The lump didn't hurt. That was almost worse somehow. If it had caused pain, he could have justified seeing a doctor, could have framed it as a practical concern. But it just sat there in his muscle, silent and waiting, and the longer he left it alone, the harder it became to acknowledge. He started wearing long pants, even in the heat of summer. Stopped going to the community center on Sunday afternoons, where ranchers gathered to drink coffee and trade complaints about beef prices and government regulations. His sister Martha noticed the change. She lived in Billings, visited once a month, and had always been able to read Tom better than anyone. When she pressed him during a visit in late May, he finally showed her the lump. Her face went pale. She'd read the newspaper story about his cattle. She'd heard the rumors that circulated through rural communities, whispered stories about ranchers and farmers who'd found objects embedded in their bodies after experiencing missing time, or finding their livestock mutilated. Martha insisted he see a doctor. Tom refused. The resistance came from somewhere deep and primal, a certainty that acknowledging the lump meant accepting something he wasn't ready to face. If he went to a doctor, there would be questions, tests, records. People would know. The isolation that had always been a simple fact of ranch life suddenly felt like exposure, like being watched from a distance by eyes he couldn't see. But Martha was stubborn, and she made calls. She found a doctor in Great Falls, a surgeon named Elizabeth Chen, who'd worked with veterinarians on some of the cattle mutilation cases. Dr. Chen had published a paper in a fringe medical journal about metallic objects recovered from livestock, objects that showed unusual elemental compositions and no clear purpose. When Martha explained Tom's situation, Dr. Chen agreed to see him privately. No official records, no questions about insurance or payment. By the time Tom drove to Great Falls in early June, he'd lost 12 pounds. He wasn't eating properly, wasn't sleeping more than a few hours at a time. The paranoia had set in slowly, then, all at once. He started noticing aircraft in the sky above his ranch, small lights moving in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be commercial flights. He heard sounds at night, low-frequency hums that vibrated in his chest. His neighbors seemed different when he saw them in town, their conversations stopping when he approached, their eyes sliding away from direct contact. He knew, on some level, that he was losing his grip, but knowing didn't help. The lump in his leg had become the center of his entire existence, a constant reminder that something had been done to him without his knowledge or consent. He was marked, changed, no longer entirely his own. Dr. Chen examined him in her office after hours. She palpated the lump, ordered an ultrasound that showed a spherical object roughly 8 millimeters in diameter, too regular in shape to be biological. She recommended immediate extraction under local anesthetic. Tom agreed, but only after she promised to let him keep whatever she found. He needed to see it, needed to hold the proof in his own hand. The surgery took less than 30 minutes. The object sat deeper than the ultrasound had suggested, embedded in the muscle tissue in a way that Dr. Chen said looked almost deliberate, positioned to avoid major blood vessels and nerve bundles. When she finally extracted it and dropped it into a sterile dish, Tom stared at something he couldn't begin to understand. The sphere was perfectly smooth, metallic gray, and covered in a fine mesh of what looked like dark fibers. Under magnification, Dr. Chen identified them as structures consistent with carbon nanotubes, a technology that in 1997 was still largely theoretical, confined to advanced research laboratories. The sphere itself showed no seams, no obvious method of construction. It was simply there, complete and inexplicable. Dr. Boonhua. Chen sent samples for analysis, calling in favors from colleagues who asked no questions. The results came back showing an alloy composition that didn't match any known manufacturing process, with ratios of metals that seemed designed for properties the analysts could only guess at. One researcher noted that similar objects had been recovered from mutilated cattle across the western United States, always spherical, always covered in the same nanotube mesh, always embedded deep in muscle tissue. Tom took the sphere home in a small plastic container. He placed it on his kitchen table and stared at it for hours, trying to understand what it meant. He was property. That was the conclusion he couldn't escape. Something had marked him the same way ranchers marked cattle, had placed this object in his body for purposes he couldn't fathom. The terror wasn't in the unknown technology or the violation of his flesh. The terror was in the implication of ownership, of being tracked and catalogued, and used in ways he would never comprehend. The community reaction, when word inevitably spread, was worse than silence. It was a kind of shunning mixed with morbid curiosity. People wanted to see the sphere, wanted to hear the story, but they didn't want to stand too close to Tom when they did. He'd become contaminated somehow, touched by something that good ranchers didn't discuss in daylight. The unspoken message was clear. This happened to people who drew attention, who acknowledged the wrongness at the edges of ordinary life. Tom still works the ranch. The sphere sits in a drawer in his bedroom, wrapped in cloth. He never washes. Sometimes late at night, he takes it out and holds it in his palm, feeling the weight of it, the absolute certainty that he's been changed in ways he'll never fully understand. The lump is gone, but the mark remains. He knows he's still being watched, still property, still waiting for whatever comes next. The drawing started in late September of 2016. 7-year-old Marcus Henley sat at the kitchen table of his family's suburban home outside Dallas, Texas, bent over sheets of construction paper with his colored pencils. His mother, Rebecca, paid little attention at first. Children drew strange things. But as the weeks progressed, the images became disturbingly consistent. Gray figures with oversized heads and enormous black eyes. Thin bodies with elongated limbs. And always, Marcus drew himself lying down, surrounded by these beings in what appeared to be a circular room bathed in blue light. Rebecca mentioned the drawings to her husband, David, one evening after putting Marcus to bed. They both worked demanding jobs. Rebecca managed accounts for a regional insurance company. David ran a small construction business. They were practical people, rooted in the tangible world of bills and schedules and soccer practice. The drawings seemed like nothing more than an overactive imagination, perhaps influenced by something Marcus had seen on television or heard from friends at school. But then came the night terrors. Marcus would wake screaming, his voice raw with genuine fear, describing the gray beings standing at the foot of his bed. He insisted they came through the walls, that they watched him, that they had plans for him. Rebecca and David took turns rushing to his room, holding their son as he trembled, his small body soaked with sweat. They bought nightlights. They let him sleep with the bedroom door open. They even consulted with his second-grade teacher, asking if anything at school might be troubling him. Nothing helped. The terrors continued, sometimes 3 or 4 nights a week. Then Marcus said something that made Rebecca's blood run cold. It was a Saturday morning in November. Marcus was drawing again at the kitchen table, creating another picture of the gray beings. Rebecca was making pancakes, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy despite her growing concern about her son's mental state. Without looking up from his drawing, Marcus said in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, "They put a seed in me, Mom. They put it in my head so they can find me." Whoa! Rebecca set down the spatula. She knelt beside her son's chair and asked him gently what he meant. Marcus pointed to his nose, then higher, indicating somewhere behind his eyes. "It's in here," he said. "They told me it's so we can talk, so they always know where I am." His tone was unsettlingly calm, as if he were describing something as ordinary as the weather. Rebecca felt a tremor of fear she couldn't quite rationalize. She told herself this was fantasy, childhood imagination run wild, but something in Marcus's certainty disturbed her deeply. The nosebleeds began 2 weeks later. They came suddenly and heavily, often in the middle of the night. Marcus would wake with blood streaming from his left nostril, staining his pillowcase dark red. Rebecca would rush him to the bathroom, tilting his head forward, applying pressure, following all the standard first aid procedures. But the frequency alarmed her. 3 times in 1 week. Then, 4. David insisted they take Marcus to their pediatrician. Dr. Sarah Chen had been Marcus's doctor since he was an infant. She was thorough and compassionate, with a no-nonsense approach that Rebecca appreciated. Dr. Chen examined Marcus, asked questions about recent injuries or falls, checked for signs of sinus infection. Finding nothing obvious, She suggested the nosebleeds might be caused by dry air or seasonal allergies. She recommended a humidifier for Marcus's bedroom and a saline nasal spray. But when Rebecca mentioned the night terrors and Marcus's insistence that something had been placed inside his head, Dr. Chen's expression shifted. She became quiet and thoughtful. Dr. Chen asked Rebecca to step into the hallway while a nurse stayed with Marcus. In the clinical brightness of the pediatric office corridor, the doctor spoke in low, measured tones. She said that, while she didn't want to alarm Rebecca unnecessarily, the combination of symptoms was unusual enough to warrant further investigation. The persistent nosebleeds, the specific location Marcus indicated, the quality of his night terrors. Dr. Chen recommended an MRI scan, explaining that she wanted to rule out any structural abnormalities, any possibility of a growth or blockage that might explain the physical symptoms. The MRI was scheduled for early December. Rebecca held Marcus's hand in the waiting room, watching her son swing his legs from the too large chair. He seemed small and vulnerable in his faded superhero t-shirt. When it was time for the scan, Marcus became anxious, frightened by the massive machine. A technician explained that he would need to stay very still inside the tunnel, that it would make loud noises, but wouldn't hurt. Rebecca was allowed to stay in the room, standing behind the protective barrier, watching through the window as her son disappeared into the humming cylinder. The results came back 3 days later. Dr. Chen called Rebecca at work and asked her to come to the office that afternoon, to bring David if possible. Rebecca's hands shook as she hung up the phone. She knew that tone, that request for both parents to come in. Nothing good ever followed those words. In Dr. Chen's office, Rebecca and David sat side by side in chairs that faced the doctor's desk. Dr. Chen pulled up the MRI images on her computer screen, rotating the three-dimensional rendering of Marcus's skull. She zoomed in on the sinus cavity, pointing to a small bright spot near the ethmoid bone, in the upper nasal passage close to the cribriform plate, the delicate structure that separates the nasal cavity from the brain. There was something there. Something that shouldn't be there. Dr. Your wise. Chen chose her words carefully. The imaging showed a foreign object, very small, approximately 3 millimeters in length. It appeared to be metallic or crystalline based on how it showed up on the scan. Its location was concerning because of its proximity to critical structures. The object was lodged in tissue that was highly vascularized, which might explain the nosebleeds. Dr. Chen said she had already consulted with a pediatric end specialist and a radiologist. Everyone agreed this needed to be addressed, but there was significant disagreement about how. The object's location made removal risky. It was nestled against the base of the skull, near nerves and blood vessels. An operation would require accessing it through the nasal passage, using endoscopic tools and extreme precision. There was risk of bleeding, risk of infection, risk of damage to surrounding tissue. But leaving it in place carried its own dangers. The nosebleeds would likely continue and potentially worsen. There was an unknown risk of migration, of the object moving and causing more serious damage. And there was the simple, terrifying fact that no one could explain what this object was or how it had gotten there. Rebecca asked the question that had been burning in her mind since Dr. Chen had first pointed to the scan. Could Marcus have inhaled something? A small piece of metal? A bead? A fragment of a toy? Dr. Chen said that was certainly possible, but the object's appearance was unusual. It wasn't irregular or jagged like most foreign bodies that ended up in nasal passages. The scan suggested a geometric structure, almost manufactured in appearance, and its precise location, deep in the upper sinus cavity, was difficult to explain through accidental inhalation, especially with no memory of such an event. David asked what Dr. Chen thought they should do. The doctor hesitated, then said honestly that this was beyond her usual scope of practice. She recommended they consult with Dr. Raymond Park, a pediatric otolaryngologist at Children's Medical Center in Dallas who specialized in complex cases. Dr. Park had reviewed the scans and was willing to see Marcus as soon as possible. The consultation with Dr. Park took place the following week. He was a man in his late 40s with silver streaking his black hair in a calm, precise manner. He examined Marcus, looked at the scans, asked detailed questions about the timeline of symptoms. Then he asked to speak with Rebecca and David privately. In a small conference room decorated with cheerful posters about ear infections and tonsillectomies, Dr. Park laid out the situation with clinical clarity. The object needed to come out. The risks of leaving it in place outweighed the surgical risks, in his professional opinion. He acknowledged the procedure would be delicate, but he had performed similar extractions before. What concerned him more, he admitted, was the nature of the object itself. In 20 years of practice, he had removed countless foreign bodies from children's noses and throats. Beads, small batteries, pieces of toys, food items. This looked like none of those. He had never seen anything quite like it on imaging. Dr. Park said something else that stayed with Rebecca long after the meeting ended. He said that if they chose to proceed with surgery, he would want to preserve the object for analysis. He wanted pathology to examine it, to determine its composition. And he suggested, somewhat reluctantly, that they might want to consider filing a report with local law enforcement, depending on what the object turned out to be. If this was some kind of implanted device, that raised serious questions about how it had gotten into a 7-year-old child's head. Rebecca felt sick. The implications were staggering. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Some kind of assault? An accident no one remembered? Or something even stranger? Something connected to Marcus's drawings and his insistence that the gray beings had put something inside him? The surgery was scheduled for January of 2017. Rebecca tried to maintain normalcy during the weeks leading up to it, but fear had settled permanently in her chest. She found herself watching Marcus constantly, checking on him at night, examining him for any signs that something was wrong beyond what they already knew. David grew quieter, more withdrawn. They didn't talk about what Marcus had said, about the seed and the gray beings. They focused on the medical facts, the surgical plan, the recovery timeline. The night before the surgery, Marcus slept in his parents' bed, nestled between Rebecca and David. At some point in the early morning hours, Rebecca woke to find Marcus sitting up, staring at the bedroom window. She asked him if he was okay, if he needed anything. Marcus turned to look at her, his face pale in the darkness, and said, "They're outside. They don't want you to take it. They're angry." The surgery took place at 7 in the morning, on a cold Thursday in January. Rebecca and David sat in the surgical waiting room for 2.5 hours, drinking bad coffee and watching morning news shows on the mounted television. Rebecca couldn't focus on anything. Time felt elastic, stretching unbearably. When Dr. Park finally emerged, still in his surgical scrubs, his expression was difficult to read. The procedure had gone well, he said. Marcus was in recovery and would wake soon. They had successfully extracted the object, with minimal bleeding and no apparent complications. But Dr. Park's tone was strange, almost uncertain. He asked Rebecca and David to follow him to a small private office. There, laid out on a sterile cloth under a high-intensity lamp, was the object. It was tiny, barely visible to the naked eye without magnification. Dr. Park had placed it under a jeweler's loop attached to an adjustable arm. Rebecca leaned in to look. What she saw defied easy description. The object was crystalline, translucent, with a geometric structure that seemed both organic and manufactured. It had facets and angles that caught the light in strange ways. And as Dr. Park adjusted the lamp, changing the wavelength of light by switching filters, Rebecca saw something impossible. The object appeared to pulse, a subtle rhythm of luminescence deep within its structure. Dr. Park said he had never seen anything like it in his career. It wasn't biological tissue. It didn't appear to be any conventional material. He had already contacted pathology and materials science departments at the medical center. There was talk of sending samples to specialized labs, of conducting advanced spectroscopic analysis. The object would need to be carefully studied. Rebecca asked if she could take Marcus home. Dr. Park said yes, pending normal recovery from anesthesia. He would want to see Marcus for follow-up in a week, and depending on what they learned about the object, there might be additional questions, additional consultations. When Rebecca and David were allowed into the recovery room, Marcus was awake, but groggy. A small bandage covered his nose. His eyes were unfocused from the anesthesia. Rebecca kissed his forehead and told him everything was okay, that the surgery was over, that he could go home soon. Marcus grabbed his mother's hand with surprising strength. His eyes suddenly focused, becoming sharp and clear. He looked directly at Rebecca and spoke in a voice that was too adult, too knowing for a 7-year-old child emerging from anesthesia. "They know you took it," Marcus said. "They'll come back for it. They'll come back for me." The words sent ice through Rebecca's veins. David stood frozen at the bedside. Marcus's eyes rolled back, and he drifted into sleep, his grip on Rebecca's hand relaxing. A nurse checked his vitals and said this was normal, that children sometimes said strange things as they emerged from anesthesia. But Rebecca knew this was different. She knew her son had spoken with terrible certainty. The family left Dallas 3 months after the surgery. David sold his construction business at a loss. Rebecca quit her job. They told friends and family that they wanted a fresh start, a new opportunity. They moved to a small town in Oklahoma, renting a house on the outskirts where the nearest neighbors were half a mile away. Marcus seemed to improve. The nosebleed stopped. The night terrors became less frequent, but he was changed, quieter, more watchful. Rebecca began noticing things. Cars that seemed to follow the same route she took to work. The same dark sedan parked on their street on multiple occasions. Hang-up calls on their home phone. She told herself it was paranoia, that the stress of everything they had been through was making her see patterns that didn't exist. But David noticed things too. Someone had been in their garage while they were out. Small items moved, nothing taken. The feeling of being watched became constant, oppressive. They moved again after 8 months in Oklahoma, this time to a rural area in Arkansas. David found work with a local contractor. Rebecca took a job at a library. They kept to themselves, made no close friends, offered no explanations for their nomadic existence. Marcus was homeschooled now. Rebecca couldn't bear the thought of him being out of her sight for hours each day. The object, meanwhile, had disappeared into the labyrinth of medical and scientific bureaucracy. Dr. Park had kept Rebecca updated initially, telling her that preliminary analysis showed the crystalline structure contained elements that didn't match any known compounds, that it seemed to generate its own electromagnetic field at certain frequencies. Then the updates stopped. When Rebecca called Dr. Park's office, she was told he was unavailable. Later calls went unreturned. When she finally reached someone at Children's Medical Center willing to discuss the case, she was told that the matter had been transferred to other authorities, and they could provide no further information. Rebecca filed requests for Marcus's medical records. The surgery was documented. The removal of a foreign object was noted, but there was no mention of the object's unusual properties, no reference to the ongoing analysis. It was as if that part of the story had been erased. The third move came in late 2018. This time they chose a small town in Montana, population just under 2,000. David found work doing maintenance for the school district. Rebecca cleaned houses. They lived in a modest rental on the edge of town, surrounded by open land where they could see anyone approaching from a distance. Marcus was 9 now, taller but still too thin, with eyes that had seen too much. He didn't draw the gray beings anymore. He never spoke about what had happened. But sometimes Rebecca would find him at the window late at night, staring out at the darkness beyond their property, watching for something only he could see. When she asked what he was looking at, Marcus would simply say, "Making sure they're not here yet." The family lives in fear of a return that may never come, trapped in an endless cycle of vigilance and flight. They have learned to recognize the signs they believe indicate surveillance. The inexplicable, technical glitches, the dreams that feel too vivid to be natural, the sensation of missing time. Whether these signs are real or imagined hardly matters anymore. The terror has become their reality, a permanent alteration of their existence. And somewhere, in a laboratory or facility whose location Rebecca can only guess at, that tiny crystalline object with its impossible properties remains. A seed, Marcus had called it. A beacon, or a message, or a piece of technology beyond human understanding. No one has told the Henley family what became of it, what secrets it might have revealed, or what purpose it served inside their son's head, for reasons they may never fully comprehend. The year is 1994, and in a quiet examination room at Harvard Medical School, a Pulitzer Prize-winning psychiatrist leans forward to study an X-ray that will eventually cost him everything. The image shows a small object, roughly 3 millimeters in length. embedded deep in the nasal cavity of a middle-aged accountant from Maine. The object shouldn't be there. More troubling still, the accountant has no memory of how it arrived. But this story doesn't begin in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It begins centuries earlier, in places where science and superstition blurred together in candlelight. Medieval texts from across Europe contain scattered references to what priests called demon stones, small, hard objects discovered in the flesh of people who claimed nocturnal visitations. A manuscript from 1263 describes a woman in northern France who complained of nosebleeds and headaches. When local healers examined her, they found a small metallic fragment lodged near her sinus cavity. The woman insisted that beings with large eyes had come to her in the night, that she'd felt a terrible pressure in her face, that she'd awakened to find blood on her pillow. The church declared her possessed. The object was confiscated and never seen again. Similar accounts appear in the journals of colonial America. In 1742, a farmer in Pennsylvania reported finding a small triangular object beneath the skin of his leg. He remembered nothing of how it got there, only a dream of floating and lights. His wife noted that he'd been missing for several hours one evening, found wandering in his fields at dawn, with no recollection of the night. The object he removed was described as impossibly smooth, resistant to their attempts to break or bend it. He kept it in a small box until his death, after which it vanished from family records. These weren't isolated incidents. They form a pattern, faint but persistent, stretching back as far as written records allow us to see. Always the same elements. Always the missing time. Always the confiscation or mysterious disappearance of physical evidence. The modern chapter of this story begins in earnest in the 1980s and 1990s, when abduction researchers started documenting something impossible to ignore. Thousands of people, scattered across continents, were reporting identical experiences. Not similar. Identical. They described the same procedures, the same beings, the same feeling of violation. And they were coming back with the same physical marks. The scoop marks appeared on arms, legs, and torsos. Perfectly circular depressions in the flesh, as though someone had removed a coarse sample of tissue. No scarring around the edges. No signs of infection. Just smooth, healed circles that witnesses swore hadn't been there the day before. Dermatologists who examined these marks found them inconsistent with any known medical procedure or natural skin condition. The tissue had been removed with precision. The healing process somehow accelerated. Then, there were the objects. Dr. Roger Leir, a California podiatric surgeon, performed the first documented surgical removal of a suspected alien implant in 1995. The patient, a man who'd experienced multiple abduction episodes, had a small raised area on his foot that caused him pain and seemed to move beneath the skin. During surgery, Leir discovered an object roughly the size of a cantaloupe seed, dark gray and metallic, surrounded by a biological membrane that had no blood supply. When he attempted to cut through this membrane, his scalpel dulled immediately. The object itself proved resistant to analysis, its composition unlike anything in standard metallurgical databases. Leir would go on to remove 17 such objects over the following years. Each removal followed the same pattern. Each object was surrounded by the same biological shielding. Each seemed to emit faint electromagnetic frequencies. And each patient reported the same aftermath, immediate relief of chronic pain, but also a persistent feeling that they'd lost something, that some connection had been severed. The objects themselves presented baffling properties. Some contained isotopic ratios, inconsistent with terrestrial materials. Others appeared to be composite structures, layers of different metals fused at temperatures that should have destroyed surrounding tissue. Several emitted radio frequencies in the low megahertz range. Laboratory analysis at New Mexico Tech found one sample contained a crystalline structure capable of acting as a semiconductor, potentially transmitting or receiving information. But it was the pattern recognition that proved most disturbing. By the mid-1990s, researchers had compiled databases of thousands of abduction accounts. The consistency was statistically impossible to dismiss. People who'd never met, who lived in different countries, who came from vastly different cultural backgrounds, were describing identical scenarios with identical physical aftereffects. They woke with nosebleeds and the taste of metal. They discovered scoop marks on their shins and calves. They found small lumps beneath their skin that hadn't been there before. They experienced missing time, typically 2 to 4 hours, with only fragmentary memories of bright lights and clinical coldness. Under regression hypnosis, they described the same procedures. A long needle inserted through the nasal cavity. A probe pushed up through the nostril, accompanied by intense pressure and a cracking sound as it penetrated the ethmoid bone. The placement of small objects in specific locations, always behind the left knee, always in the right shoulder, always in the nasal cavity near the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate, that thin, porous bone that separates the nasal cavity from the brain. That's where the implants were most commonly reported. That's where X-rays most frequently revealed anomalous objects. And that's precisely the location that provides the shortest route to the limbic system, the seat of memory and emotion in the human brain. Into this growing body of evidence walked Dr. John Mack, chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital, Harvard Medical School professor, Pulitzer Prize winner, a man whose credentials placed him at the absolute pinnacle of academic psychiatry. His involvement would legitimize the abduction phenomenon in ways the field had never experienced. It would also destroy his career. Mack began studying abduction reports in 1990, initially as a skeptic. He expected to find trauma survivors manufacturing false memories, attention seekers spinning elaborate fantasies. Instead, he found ordinary people, psychologically healthy by every clinical measure, traumatized by experiences they desperately wished hadn't happened. They weren't seeking attention. They were seeking help, terrified by memories they couldn't reconcile with their understanding of reality. Over 4 years, Mack conducted extensive interviews with over 200 abductees. He employed rigorous clinical methods, screening for mental illness, cross-referencing accounts, searching for any conventional explanation. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that these people were describing real experiences, even if those experiences defied conventional understanding of what reality permitted. In 1994, Mack published Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens. The book presented case studies, clinical observations, and a careful argument that the phenomenon deserved serious scientific investigation. The response from the academic establishment was immediate and devastating. Harvard launched an unprecedented investigation into Mack's clinical work, the first time in the university's history that a tenured professor had been subjected to such scrutiny for their research conclusions. Colleagues who'd respected him for decades suddenly refused to meet his eyes in faculty meetings. Conference invitations evaporated. Graduate students were quietly discouraged from working with him. The message was clear: legitimize abduction research and face professional annihilation. The 14-month investigation eventually concluded that Mack had committed no ethical violations, but the damage was done. His reputation was permanently compromised. Here was a man with impeccable credentials, using accepted clinical methods, reporting findings that thousands of witnesses corroborated, and the institutional response was character assassination. The question haunted Mack until his death in 2004. Why such aggressive suppression? Why such determination to prevent legitimate investigation? His private papers suggest he'd begun to suspect the answer. The phenomenon wasn't being ignored. It was being actively managed. Multiple abductees reported mysterious follow-up encounters after their experiences became public. Men in dark suits appearing at their homes, claiming to be from various government agencies, demanding any physical evidence. X-rays confiscated from medical offices. Implants removed by surgeons and immediately seized by individuals who produced impressive but ultimately unverifiable credentials. The pattern suggested organized retrieval operations, systematic suppression of physical evidence. Dr. Leir documented several cases where implants he'd removed were confiscated within hours of surgery. In one instance, men identifying themselves as Air Force intelligence officers appeared at his clinic, presented official-looking documents, and demanded the object he'd removed that morning. When Leir requested time to verify their credentials, they informed him that refusal would result in the immediate revocation of his medical license. He handed over the implant. The officers left. Subsequent inquiries to the Air Force revealed no record of the visit, no personnel matching the descriptions, no operation authorized for that date. This happened repeatedly. Surgeons across the country reported identical encounters. remove an implant, lose the implant. The confiscations followed a clear protocol, suggesting coordination at levels of government or military most people never glimpse. Meanwhile, the scale of the phenomenon was emerging from survey data that researchers found almost impossible to accept. A 1992 Roper poll, designed to screen for abduction indicators without directly mentioning aliens, produced results that sent shockwaves through the research community. Based on responses regarding specific physical marks, missing time episodes, and recurring nightmares with consistent themes, statistical extrapolation suggested that nearly 4 million Americans might have experienced abduction event. 4 million. Roughly 2% of the population. Subsequent international surveys suggested similar percentages globally. If even half these estimates approached accuracy, the phenomenon wasn't rare. It was common. Millions of people carrying memories of experiences they couldn't explain, many carrying physical objects they didn't know existed. Because that's the truly unsettling aspect of implant research. Most people who carry them have no idea. The objects are typically small, 2 to 5 millimeters. They're placed in areas where small lumps wouldn't cause concern. Behind the knee, where people assume it's a cyst. In the shoulder, easily mistaken for a harmless lipoma. In the nasal cavity, completely invisible without specific medical imaging. How many people walk through their lives carrying these objects, never thinking to look, never suspecting they're part of something vast and organized? The evidence points toward an operation of staggering scale and sophistication. An operation that's been ongoing not for years, but for centuries, if medieval accounts hold any truth. An operation that requires the ability to enter homes undetected, to overcome human consciousness, to perform precise medical procedures, and to track millions of individuals across their lifetimes. An operation that possesses technology decades or centuries beyond our current capabilities. And perhaps most disturbing, an operation that appears to have the tacit cooperation, or at minimum the enforced silence, of institutional power structures worldwide. When Mac died in 2004, struck by a drunk driver in London, some researchers whispered about convenient timing. He'd been planning a new book, one that would detail military involvement in implant retrieval. Those plans died with him. The research continues, but quietly now. Surgeons who remove implants rarely publicize their work. Witnesses who come forward do so anonymously. The academic establishment has made clear the cost of serious investigation. The military continues to confiscate evidence when it surfaces. But the pattern remains, undeniable and expanding. Thousands of new cases reported each year. Thousands of people discovering marks on their bodies, gaps in their memories, objects beneath their skin. All describing the same procedures, all bearing the same physical evidence, all part of something far larger than individual experience. The implications resist comfortable interpretation. Either millions of people across centuries are experiencing identical delusions, complete with identical physical marks and implanted objects of unknown composition. Or something is conducting a multi-generational operation of global scale, tagging and tracking humanity with the methodical precision of wildlife biologists, monitoring a vast, unwitting population. The evidence suggests the latter. The silence of institutions suggests they know it. The case of Sarah Chen remains the most thoroughly documented and deeply disturbing account in the entire history of abduction research. What sets her experience apart isn't merely the trauma she endured, but the physical evidence that followed her ordeal, evidence that would eventually prove both her salvation and her curse. On the morning of November 14, 2003, Sarah failed to arrive at her job as a hospital administrator in Portland, Oregon. Her car sat undisturbed in her apartment parking lot. Her phone remained on the kitchen counter. Her purse, keys, and wallet were all exactly where they should be. Sarah Chen had simply vanished from a locked apartment on the third floor of a secured building. 3 days later, she reappeared in that same locked apartment, discovered by building maintenance who had been called by her increasingly frantic employer. Sarah was found on her living room floor, still wearing the pajamas she'd worn when she disappeared. She was conscious but severely disoriented, unable to explain where she had been or what had happened during those 72 missing hours. The only physical signs of her ordeal were 3 small marks on her body, A red puncture wound on her left hand between her thumb and index finger, a similar mark on her right ankle, and a persistent sharp pain behind her left eye that wouldn't subside. Medical examination at the emergency room found her physically unharmed, aside from mild dehydration. But the attending physician noted something unusual during the standard X-rays. There appeared to be small foreign objects embedded in her tissue at each location where she'd reported discomfort. When pressed about what these objects might be, Sarah had no memory of any injury or procedure. She had no memory of anything at all from those 3 lost days. The investigating detective assigned to her missing persons case, a veteran officer named Marcus Webb, had seen many strange things in his 20-year career, but nothing quite prepared him for what would unfold. He suggested Sarah speak with a colleague of his, a clinical psychologist named Dr. Patricia Reeves, who specialized in recovered memory therapy. Detective Webb made this recommendation not because he believed in anything paranormal, but because he'd exhausted every conventional avenue of investigation, and Sarah clearly needed help processing her trauma. Dr. Reeves conducted her first hypnotic regression session with Sarah 2 weeks after her reappearance. The psychologist would later describe that initial session as the most unsettling professional experience of her career. Under hypnosis, Sarah's calm demeanor shattered. She began describing a structured sequence of events with remarkable consistency and disturbing detail. Sarah recalled waking in her apartment to a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. She remembered being unable to move, paralyzed but fully conscious as she felt herself lifted through the air. She described passing through the ceiling of her apartment as though it weren't solid matter at all, emerging into a brilliant white space that hurt to perceive. The next memory was of a circular room with walls that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. She wasn't alone. There were beings in the room with her, though she struggled to describe their exact appearance. Their forms seemed to slide away from direct observation, as if her mind couldn't quite hold on to what her eyes were seeing. What Sarah could describe with crystalline clarity were the procedures they performed. She was placed on a table that molded itself to her body, holding her immobile without restraints. The beings worked with instruments that looked nothing like medical equipment, tools that seemed to phase partially in and out of visibility. She felt a sharp, burning sensation in her left hand as something was inserted deep into the tissue. The pain was precise and localized, nothing like any injury she'd experienced before. She watched, unable to turn away, as they repeated the process with her ankle. The implement they used looked like a needle, but it moved with intelligence, burrowing into her flesh and depositing something she couldn't see before withdrawing without leaving any visible wound. The procedure behind her eye was the worst. Sarah recalled her terror as one of the beings approached with an impossibly thin probe. She felt it slide through the tear duct, felt the pressure building behind her eyeball, felt the unmistakable sensation of something foreign being embedded deep in the tissue of her orbital socket. Throughout all of this, she remained completely paralyzed, unable to scream or resist. But the most disturbing element of Sarah's regression testimony wasn't the physical procedures. It was her description of the communication that occurred during the process. She reported that the beings transmitted thoughts directly into her mind, not in words but in concepts and feelings. The message was clear. They were marking her. These objects served a purpose she couldn't fully comprehend, something to do with tracking and monitoring. They told her, in that wordless way, that she was part of something larger, a long-term study that had been ongoing for what felt like generations. Dr. Reeves conducted 7 regression sessions over the course of 3 months. Each session revealed additional layers of detail, but the core narrative never wavered. Sarah described the same circular room, the same procedures, the same beings. She provided information about the craft's interior layout, the quality of the light, even the emotional states of the entities working on her. The consistency was remarkable. Dr. Reeves had seen false memories before, had witnessed how suggestion and imagination could create elaborate fiction under hypnosis. This was different. The emotional authenticity of Sarah's responses, the physiological stress markers that appeared during recall, all suggested she was accessing genuine traumatic memories. Detective Webb, despite his initial skepticism, found himself disturbed by the regression transcripts. He'd also been quietly investigating the physical evidence. those 3 foreign objects still embedded in Sarah's body. After consultation with Sarah and her physicians, the decision was made to surgically remove all 3 implants for analysis. The coordinated surgery took place on March 7, 2004, at Oregon Health and Science University. 3 surgical teams worked simultaneously under the direction of Dr. Raymond Foster, a specialist in foreign object removal. The procedure to extract the object from Sarah's hand took 45 minutes. The surgeon described it as unlike anything he'd encountered in 30 years of practice. The object was approximately 5 millimeters long, metallic in appearance, and was surrounded by a biological membrane that wasn't consistent with typical foreign body response. The tissue around it showed no signs of inflammation or infection, despite having been embedded for months. More strangely, the object seemed to have integrated itself with the surrounding nerves and blood vessels in a way that suggested biological activity. The ankle extraction proved even more complex. The object there had positioned itself directly adjacent to the posterior tibial nerve. Removing it required microsurgery to carefully separate the implant from nerve tissue without causing permanent damage. Dr. Sante Foster noted that the object appeared to have tiny filaments extending from its surface that had intertwined with the nerve fibers, as if it had grown there organically rather than being artificially inserted. The orbital extraction was the most delicate and dangerous procedure. A specialized ophthalmologic surgeon spent over 2 hours carefully accessing the region behind Sarah's left eye. The implant was located in the retrobulbar space, nested against the optic nerve. The surgeon later reported that the object seemed to resist removal, that he felt unusual resistance as he attempted to extract it, as though it was anchored by invisible connections. When it finally came free, Sarah's vital signs spiked dramatically despite the anesthesia, her body responding to the removal with what appeared to be a stress reaction, far beyond what the procedure should have caused. All 3 objects were immediately transported to a materials analysis laboratory at a nearby research university. Dr. Ellen Zhao, a materials scientist specializing in metallurgy and rare earth elements, led the analysis team. What they discovered defied conventional explanation. The objects were structurally similar, but not identical. Each measured between 4 and 6 millimeters in length and appeared to be composed of multiple layers. The outer shell contained a crystalline matrix incorporating rare earth elements, yttrium, europium, and terbium, in concentrations and configurations that Dr. Zhao stated were technically impossible with current manufacturing methods. The atomic structure of the material showed organization patterns that didn't match any known natural or artificial process. The elements were arranged in a lattice formation that seemed designed for maximum information density, though what information it might contain remained inaccessible. More disturbing than the exotic materials was the biological component. Each implant was surrounded by a thin membrane of living tissue. DNA analysis of this tissue revealed something that should have been impossible. It contained genetic markers that were partially human, but included sequences that matched no known terrestrial organism. The tissue was vascularized, containing what appeared to be miniature blood vessels, though the fluid within them wasn't human blood. Spectroscopic analysis showed the presence of proteins with amino acid chains that included molecular configurations unknown to biochemistry. Dr. Zhao's official report, a copy of which remains in the case file, concluded with an unprecedented statement for a scientific document. She wrote that the objects appeared to be hybrid technology combining advanced materials science with biological engineering, far beyond current human capabilities. She could not explain their origin or purpose, but stated definitively that they could not have been manufactured with any technology available on Earth. Sarah's experience in the months following the extraction surgery added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish case. She reported persistent phantom sensations, the feeling that the implants were still in place despite their verified removal. She described it as a presence in her mind, a sense of being observed that wouldn't fade. She would wake in the night convinced that something was probing the empty spaces where the objects had been, searching for them, finding them absent. The psychological toll was severe. Sarah began experiencing anxiety attacks, convinced that the removal had angered whatever force had placed the implants. Dr. Reeves continued therapy sessions, but Sarah's condition deteriorated rather than improved. She became increasingly isolated, afraid to sleep, convinced that they would come back for her. 6 months after the extraction surgery, on September 23, 2004, Sarah Chen disappeared again. This time, the absence lasted only 18 hours, but when she was found in her apartment the next morning, the familiar pattern had repeated. She was disoriented, missing time she couldn't account for, and experiencing pain in a new location, her right shoulder blade. X-rays confirmed what Sarah already knew in her bones. There was a new implant embedded deep in the tissue of her upper back, in a location that would be nearly impossible to access surgically without significant risk. This object was larger than the previous 3, measuring approximately 8 millimeters in length. Its position suggested deliberate placement in a site that would be difficult to remove, as if the previous extractions had been noted, and this new protocol designed to prevent future interference. Sarah refused another surgery. She understood, with the terrible clarity that comes from repeated trauma, that removal was futile. They had demonstrated their ability to take her whenever they wished, to mark her however they chose. The physical evidence that had once seemed like potential proof now felt like a violation that could be perpetually renewed. She was tagged, tracked, and utterly unable to prevent whatever they intended to do with her. Detective Webb closed the case file, though he never stopped thinking about Sarah Chen. Dr. Reeves continued to see her occasionally, though the therapy sessions became less about recovery and more about learning to live with inescapable surveillance. Dr. Zhao kept the extracted implants in a secure laboratory vault, 3 impossible objects that proved something had happened, even if no one could fully explain what. The implication of Sarah's case extends far beyond one woman's nightmare. If the technology exists to mark human beings at will, to remove them from locked rooms and return them changed, then the question isn't whether abduction is real. The question is how many others are walking around right now, carrying similar objects in their bodies, unaware or unable to speak of what was done to them. The question is whether resistance is even possible, or if some of us are simply specimens in a study we can never escape, subjects marked and monitored by forces we can't comprehend and can't escape. Sarah Chen's story suggests that once you've been chosen, once you've been marked, removal is just temporary. They can always put them back. The human body knows when something foreign enters it. We have immune systems designed to recognize what belongs and what doesn't, to fight what shouldn't be there. But what happens when that defense system never activates? What happens when these objects, these implants, settle into flesh and bone as if they were always meant to be there, as if they're more than just foreign bodies, but invitations to something we cannot yet understand? After decades of removal surgeries, after hundreds of objects extracted from people who swear they never consented to any procedure, we return to the question that haunts every researcher who has held one of these implants in their hands. What are they? And more importantly, what are they for? Dr. Harold Weinstein spent 8 months analyzing 17 implants removed from abductees across the southwestern United States. The objects varied in size, from smaller than a grain of rice to nearly 3 centimeters in length. Some were metallic. Others appeared organic. Several defied easy classification, seeming to shift between states depending on the temperature of the room or the proximity to electronic equipment. He documented everything. He photographed each specimen from multiple angles. He subjected them to spectroscopy, electron microscopy, and chemical analysis. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in 2019, he packed them all into sterile containers, sealed them, and placed them in storage. When colleagues asked when he planned to resume his research, he told them never. When pressed for a reason, he would only say that some questions are dangerous to answer. The implants remain in storage. Dr. Weinstein now refuses to discuss them entirely. He is not alone. At least 6 researchers with backgrounds in materials science, biology, and physics have similarly withdrawn from implant analysis after initial examination. They do not publish papers explaining their decisions. They do not warn others away from the work. They simply stop, as if they've seen something that changed the fundamental nature of the question they were trying to answer. What could make a scientist abandon a potentially groundbreaking discovery? What conclusions could be so disturbing that continued research becomes impossible? Some who have seen the classified reports The ones that never make it to peer review speak carefully about patterns. Not in the objects themselves, but in their placement. When you map the locations where implants have been found, not the locations of the abductions but the actual geographical coordinates of the individuals carrying them, something emerges. Clusters. Concentrations in specific regions that seem random until you overlay other data. Population centers. Military installations. Areas of unusual geological activity. Places where the Earth's magnetic field behaves strangely. But even more unsettling than where these objects are found is who carries them. The assumption for years was that abductees were chosen randomly, that anyone could be taken. But deeper analysis suggests otherwise. Certain families show up repeatedly across generations. A woman in Oregon has an implant. Her mother had one removed in 1993. Her grandmother reported missing time and unexplained scars in the 1960s. 3 generations, 3 objects, each placed in nearly the same location behind the left ear. This isn't random selection. This is tracking. This is lineage. This is something identifying specific genetic lines and marking them across time. The question of why becomes almost unbearable when you consider what it implies about intent, about planning, about how long this has been happening. And then there's the timing. Reports of alien abduction and implant discoveries have existed for decades, but the frequency is changing. Removal surgery requests have increased 300% in the past 10 years. 300%. That's not an increase in awareness. That's an increase in occurrence. More people are finding these objects. More people are feeling something inside them that shouldn't be there. More people are waking up with scars they cannot explain, and the terrible certainty that their body has been altered without consent. Some choose not to remove them. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire phenomenon. When offered the option of surgery, when presented with the opportunity to have these foreign objects extracted from their bodies, a significant percentage of abductees refuse. They say they're afraid of retaliation, afraid that removal will trigger something worse than having the implant, afraid that the object is somehow protecting them now, that its presence marks them as claimed, and that being unmarked makes them vulnerable in ways they cannot articulate. Imagine living with that calculus. Imagine knowing something is inside you, placed there without your knowledge or permission, possibly tracking you, possibly changing you at a cellular level, and still choosing to keep it because you fear what might happen if you don't. That's not a decision made from paranoia. That's a decision made from experience, from people who believe, based on what they've lived through, that being marked is safer than being unmarked. The implants in storage sit in laboratories and private facilities around the world. Some are kept in universities. Some are held by independent researchers. Some are in government facilities that don't officially acknowledge their existence. They sit in sealed containers, inert or seemingly inert, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to ask the next question. But the questions multiply faster than the answers. Why are the patterns in placement so precise? Some implants are found in the nasal cavity, others behind the ear, still others in the leg or hand. But within each location, the positioning is remarkably consistent. Millimeters of variation, as if whoever placed them is following an exact template. Are these locations neurologically significant? Are they chosen for access to specific biological systems? Or is the placement itself a marker, a way of categorizing different types of subjects for different types of monitoring? Why certain individuals? If this is genetic tracking, what are they tracking? What trait or characteristic spans these families? Is it something physical, something in the blood or bone? Or is it something we don't have the ability to measure yet, something that our current science cannot detect, but that someone or something else can? And if they're marking genetic lines, what happens when those lines have been marked for 3 or 4 generations? What comes after the marking? Why now? Why is the phenomenon accelerating? Are we approaching some threshold, some point at which the observation phase ends and something else begins? Or has it always been at this frequency and we're only now developing the technology and awareness to recognize it? The 300% increase in removal requests suggests the former. Something is changing. The pace is quickening. How many people are walking around right now, completely unaware that they're carrying something inside them? How many have never experienced conscious missing time? Never had a dramatic abduction experience? Never woken up with unexplained scars, but still carry these objects? If only a fraction of abductees remember their experiences, if missing time can be complete and total, then the number of people with implants could be vastly larger than the number of people who know they have them. Think about that. Think about sitting next to someone on the bus, standing in line at the grocery store, working in the cubicle next to yours, and not knowing that they're carrying something that's tracking them, changing them, marking them for a purpose we cannot comprehend. Think about the possibility that you are that person. That something happened that you don't remember, that some night you cannot fully account for resulted in an alteration you've never detected. The technology to scan for these objects exists, but it's not routine. No doctor orders an implant screening during your annual physical. Insurance doesn't cover it. Most radiologists wouldn't know what they were looking at if they saw one. So they remain hidden, tucked into tissue and bone, doing whatever it is they do, communicating with whatever it is they communicate with, for whatever purpose we have not yet determined. This is the central horror of the implant phenomenon. Not that it happened, but that it might still be happening. Not that they took some people, but that they might have taken far more than we know. Not that we don't understand the purpose, but that we might understand it soon, and that understanding might be worse than the mystery. The rain outside sounds different when you realize you might not be alone in your own body. Every sensation becomes suspect. Every unexplained ache. Every moment of déjà vu. Every time you lose a few minutes and can't quite remember what you were doing. The boundary between self and other, between your flesh and what's been placed inside it, becomes uncertain. And in that uncertainty lives a dread that no amount of rational explanation can fully dispel. Because some of those explanations have already come back from the laboratory, and the scientists who saw them decided that not knowing was safer than knowing more. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.